your attention, please. Thank you. Thank you so much. I'd like you once more to welcome you on behalf of the Puravut Center for the Study of the Iranian World, the Program of Iranian Studies at NELC, as well as the Kotsin Institute of Archaeology, which has been providing graciously its seminar room to us. So the fourth lecture of the 10th Ehsan Yarshater lecture series at UCLA, held by my esteemed colleague, Professor Daniel Potts. I'm not going to go to the lengthy introduction that I have read time and again to you. Just a few words to the Yarshater lecture series and to the person itself. The Yarshater lecture series was inspired by the Quatre Leçons au Collège de France and was endowed by the late Professor Ehsan Yarshater. They are usually delivered by a distinguished scholar within Iranian studies who would have an impact, a lasting impact upon the field. Each series consists of a series of 4 to 5 lectures on a single theme that is then subsequently made into a monograph through subsequent amplifications. Dr. Daniel Potts, our Yarshater lecture series this year, is Professor of Ancient Near Eastern Archaeology and History in the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World, Ehsan, at New York University. Before joining Ehsan at NYU, he taught previously at the Freie Universität Berlin, the University of Copenhagen, and the University of Sydney. His main areas of interest are Greater Iran, Mesopotamia, and the Persian Gulf, and he's really the foremost specialist on the state of ancient Elam. In his fourth lecture today, entitled Descent and Marriage in Achaemenid Iran, Dan Potts shall be turning his attention to the Achaemenid world, finally, and examining the use of ethnos and genos in Herodotus' discussion of Median and Persian tribes. Thereupon shall follow a discussion of Darius' genealogy, Xerxes' succession, and Sisigambis, in case that you know who Sisigambis is, that is the mother of Darius III, the last king of Persia, defeated by Alexander the Great. So Sisigambis' filiation and descent, cross-cousin and parallel cousin marriages in the Achaemenid Iran among the royal families, as well as uncle, niece, and brother-sister incest. So it is a lot of fun today. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Potts.
Well, with the Medes and the Persians, we leave the realm of what is usually considered the aboriginal peoples of the Iranian plateau and lowland Khuzestan and into the Indo-European or Indo-Iranian realm. At the outset, I'd like to just look briefly at the question of whether or not the Medes of Western Iran, Western Central Iran, were a tribal people. Although Albert ten Eyck Olmsted, the great Chicago ancient historian, considered the Medes, quote, essentially nomadic, although they had been settled long enough in the mountains to have taken on some of the characteristics of a sedentary people, the Neo-Assyrian sources make it clear that the Median landscape was dominated by towns, villages, and fortresses overseen by Bel Ali, or city lords. Discussing the Median people, for which he uses the Greek noun ethnos, Herodotus lists the names of 6 Median genea, tribes or descent groups, the Busai, Paratakeni, Struchates, Arizanti, Budi, and Magi. Discussing Herodotus' use of the terms ethnos and genos, Christopher P. Jones noted that, quote, while he might mean the second to be a subdivision of the first, that is, in this case, the genea, tribes or descent groups, to be subsets of the Median ethnos, or people or nation, he could equally well be referring to these 6 groups as hereditary. I had to ask him about this, what he exactly meant, or as he put it, united by birth, or a genetic group and not an ancestral one. Most modern scholarship prefers to see Herodotus' Medikos Logos as largely fictitious and cautions against its use as an historical source, to cite Karen Rodner. Herodotus, of course, also famously wrote that, quote, there are many tribes in Persia, and went on to name the Pasargadae, the Marathians, and the Maspians, upon whom all the other Persians hang. The Achaemenids, by which he presumably meant the descent group of the eponymous Achaemenids, were part of the Pasargadae, a Königshaus, in the words of Hans Heinrich Scheder. In describing the Achaemenids, Herodotus used the term fratre, and it is remarkable that he used this for no other social or demographic category discussed in his work. Several years ago, the ancient Greek historian Pietro Vannicelli noted, "Fratre is generally translated clan, but this translation does not really help in understanding the definition given by Herodotus." And he went on to note that the genos, possibly a descent group, as mentioned earlier, is a subset of the phratry in normal Greek usage. Lewis Henry Morgan considered the phratry to be a brotherhood, as the term imports, and a natural growth from the organization into gentes. He wrote, "It is an organic union or association of two or more gentes of the same tribe for common objects." This is actually the opposite of what Herodotus implies when he calls the Achaemenid phratry part of the Pasargadae genos. Moreover, genos is the term used for tribe when Herodotus and Ctesias discuss the Mardoi. But as Zara and Herzfeld noted in 1910, the question of clans and tribes in ancient Iran is complicated. They cited the great German Iranologist Friedrich Karl Andreas, who suggested that the record of Darius I's descent, given in Naqsh Rustam A, son of Ishtaspa of the Achaemenid clan, a Persian, son of a Persian, and Aryan of Aryan lineage, is a direct reflection of the Avestan social terminology I've mentioned several times already, from family or house, Nemana, village, clan, vis, and tribe, Zantu, to land, Dahu. Emil Benveniste and Arthur Christensen both felt the quadripartite division of Iranian patriarchal society was essentially territorial, whereas for Antoine Maillet it was political. For Andreas, it was both territorial and social. Vis, he thought, could refer to the clan's village or habitat or to the people themselves. With respect to the term Hakamanashia or Achaemenid used by Darius, this has been called a Zippenbezeichnung or a pro-patronymic and is known both from Herodotus and from Darius I's Spisatun inscription, in which the Persian king, as is well known, traced his descent via Hystaspes, Arsames, Ariaramnes, and Tespes, thereby establishing a link to Cyrus back to the eponymous Achaemenids. Much has been written over the years on the subject of the veracity or otherwise of Darius's lineage. Pierre Briand, for example, wrote of Darius's insistence, quote, "not without falsification of his filiation," or more correctly, as I would say, his descent. One relevant point has been largely overlooked in the debate over Darius's claims, however. As Bronislaw Malinowski pointed out, a genealogy should be viewed as a legal charter rather than an historical record. Echoing this point, A.R. Radcliffe Brown noted in 1935 that genealogy is fundamentally a jural concept. Similarly, as Meyer Fortes noted many years ago, quote, "If there's one thing that all recent investigations are agreed upon, it is that lineage genealogies are not historically accurate. But they can be understood if they are seen to be the conceptualization of the existing lineage structure viewed as continuing through time and therefore projected backward as pseudo-history." In fact, the anthropologists Paul and Laura Bohannon documented among the Tiv of northern Nigeria the rearranging their lineage genealogies to bring them into line with changes in the existing pattern of legal and political relations within and between lineages. Does this remind anyone else besides me of Darius? Before leaving Darius I, I'd like to turn to the choice of his successor. In 2015, Richard Stoneman discussed the topic at length in his book on Xerxes. His two main sources, Herodotus and Justin, are largely in agreement. According to Herodotus, quote, "Before Darius became king, he already had 3 sons from his earlier wife, the daughter of Gobryas. After he became king, he had 4 more by Atossa, the daughter of Cyrus. The eldest of the first 3 was Ariobarzanes, and Xerxes of the second family. As they were not from the same mother, they were at odds with each other. Ariobarzanes claiming that he was the eldest of all the children and that it was customary among all mankind for the eldest to have precedence, while Xerxes claimed that he was the son of the daughter of Cyrus, and it was Cyrus who had established freedom for the Persians. Justin differs in naming Ariaramnes as the eldest of Darius's first group of children rather than Ariobarzanes. noting, quote, he claimed the throne by reason of his age. Order of birth and nature itself had established this law among all people. But Xerxes wanted to move the debate, not to the issue of rank, but to the timing of their birth. In his view, Ariaramnes was certainly Darius's firstborn, but while Darius was still a subject, whereas he was the firstborn of Darius as king. For that reason, his older brother was entitled to claim the private property which their father had owned, but not the throne. But it was he who was the first child born to his father after his accession to the throne. Even were it to be supposed that the two brothers had equal rights because of their father, he would still win out because of his mother and paternal grandfather, that is, Atossa and Cyrus. So the justification for the elevation of Xerxes implied by Justin is descent or pedigree, as opposed to the influence of his mother Atossa, as sometimes said. The sources agree in recognizing her as a daughter of Cyrus the Great, whereas Darius's first wife was a daughter of Gobryas. I suggest that filiation was the decisive factor in the promotion of Xerxes over Ariobarzanes, not the fact that Darius was king when Xerxes was born, but not when Ariobarzanes was born. A parallel situation occurred over 2,000 years later in Fatali Shah's choice of Abbas Mirza, his second, third, or fourth son, depending on which source one believes, as crown prince over his eldest son, Muhammad Ali Mirza. For the mother of Muhammad Ali Mirza was a Georgian slave, whereas that of Abbas Mirza was Asiya Khanum, daughter of Fatali Khan Develu, whom Fatali Shah had married at the behest of his uncle and predecessor on the Qajar throne, Aga Muhammad Shah. As James Silk Buckingham noted in 1830, Fatali's eldest two sons, Muhammad Vali Mirza and Muhammad Vali Mirza and Muhammad Ali Mirza, are, quote, the offspring of the king by Georgian women. The third is by a high-born female of the Qajar tribe and is therefore chosen to succeed the king, a justification echoed also by Edward Eichwald in 1837. A curious case of kin relations in the late Achaemenid period is afforded by an episode recounted by both Diodorus and Quintus Curtius. En route from Susa to Persepolis, Alexander was held up in the mountain territory of the Uxians. Their governor was one Madates, who initially put up stiff resistance to the Macedonian advance until he was forced to seek refuge in a mountain citadel from which he only emerged thanks to the intervention of Sisigambis, the mother of Darius III. Alexander's relationship with Sisigambis is described at length by Quintus Curtius. Under severe pressure, the Uxians applied to her to use her good offices with Alexander in order to pardon them, quote, both those who had been taken prisoner and those who had surrendered. This personal intervention has recently led Ali Bahadouri, in an article on the Achaemenid Empire and what he calls the tribal confederation of southwestern Persia, to assume that both Sisigambis and Madates were Uxians, which made her, quote, an ideal person to negotiate with Alexander. This hypothesis is unfortunately flatly contradicted by the ancient sources, which show that Sisigambis was a granddaughter of Darius II, probably a daughter of Ostanes Ushtana, brother of Artaxerxes II, and hence a niece of Artaxerxes II. And she was thus a first cousin of Artaxerxes III. Diodorus says that Darius III was, quote, the son of Arsanes, hence Arsanes was Sisigambis' husband, and grandson of that Ostanes, who was a brother of Artaxerxes, who had been king, that is Artaxerxes II. The credit for unraveling the mysteries of Sisigambis' filiation and descent goes to the ancient historian Otto Neuhaus, who published an article on this subject in 1902 that is yet to be improved upon. One explanation of Sisigambis' efforts on behalf of Madates is given by Quintus Curtius, according to whom Madates was married to her niece, specifically the daughter of her sister, quote, and thus was a near relative of Darius. Diodorus, on the other hand, calls Madates a sugenes, or kinsman, of Darius III. As anyone can appreciate who's ever delved into the terminology for cousin, nephew, and related kin terms in Greek, Latin, or any other Indo-European language, Bradford Wells' identification of Medates as Darius's cousin in his Loeb Classical Library edition of Diodorus unnecessarily confuses their relationship. Rather, the translation kinsman is entirely appropriate, given that Medates was not a blood relation of Darius, but was married to a first cousin of his, and was therefore what we would more probably call a cousin by marriage. One further point about Sisigambis is interesting. According to Quintus Curtius, she had 80 brothers, all of whom, as well as her father, were killed by Artaxerxes III. In the account given by Valerius Maximus, the deed was even worse. For Artaxerxes III confined his sister, mother-in-law, uncle, and over 100 children and grandchildren in a courtyard and had them killed by archers, simply because their reputation for virtue was so great. Justin, on the other hand, said, quote, "Possession of the throne was given to Ochus, Artaxerxes III, who, dreading a similar conspiracy to that perpetrated against his father Artaxerxes II, filled the palace with the blood and dead bodies of his kinsmen and the nobility, being touched with compassion neither for consanguinity, nor sex, nor age, lest apparently he should be thought less wicked than his brothers that had meditated parricide." Neuhaus interpreted this as the politically motivated elimination of all members of the Achaemenid house and court, regardless of age, sex, or degree of relationship, who represented a potential threat to his possession of the throne, arguing persuasively that all three accounts reported on one and the same mass murder. The only discrepancy in the accounts is that between the figure of 80 brothers of Sisigambis, according to Quintus Curtius, whereas Valerius Maximus wrote of over 100 children and grandchildren of Sisigambis' father. The numbers are obviously impressive, and we should note that Justin also says that Artaxerxes II had 118 sons, 3 by, quote, lawful wedlock, and 115 by his concubines. For 21st century readers, these numbers may seem unbelievable, but a quick look at some data from the Qajar period again shows us they are not at all. Fatali Shah, for example, had 4 legitimate wives and 154 secondary wives, who bore a total of 265 children. Of these, 159 died in infancy, while 106 reached maturity. 6 of these predeceased him, leaving 55 sons and 45 daughters who survived him. As for orchestrating the murder of 80 or 100 potential rivals, it should be remembered that in 1725, after the flight of Tahmasp Mirza, later Tahmasp II, and after Shah Sultan Hussein's death, the Afghan ruler Mahmud had, by some accounts, 300, by other accounts, 105 Safavid nobles and their children, including 3 uncles and 7 nephews of Shah Sultan Hussein, murdered in a single event, so as to almost entirely extinguish the Safavid nobility. I'd like to turn now to preferential marriage patterns among the Achaemenids. The ancient historian Maria Brosius has declared that, quote, Persian kings established their connections with the Persian nobility through a deliberate marriage policy. But she remained vague on how exactly this was done. By contrast, in a study published over 30 years ago on kinship in the early Achaemenid period, the French scholar Clarice Herenschmidt identified several cases of what she identified as cross-cultural and parallel cousin marriage. The first of these is the alleged cross-cousin mother's brother's daughter's marriage between Cyrus the Great's son and heir, Cambyses, and his matrilateral cousin, Phidime, the daughter of Cambyses' maternal uncle, Otanes, that is, his mother, Cassandane's brother. The problem here is that Otanes was almost certainly not the brother of Cyrus's wife, Cassandane. Rather, Herodotus seems to have confused the identities of several homonymous Otanes. For although he says that Cyrus's wife Cassandane was the daughter of the Achaemenid Pharnaspes, and that Pharnaspes in birth and wealth was in birth and wealth the equal of the foremost Persians, and also had a son named Otanes, the Bisatun inscription, paragraph 68, identifies Otanes' father as Thukra. Moreover, other sources, such as Ctesias, identify Cambyses' mother not as Cassandane, but as Amytis, a daughter of the Mede Astyages, while Dinan and Lysias of Naucratis identify her as an Egyptian princess named Nityetis. The second cross-cousin marriage to which Herrenschmidt drew attention appears more certain, and was between Mardonius, quote, a young man and son of Gobryas, the ally of Darius I and husband of an unnamed sister of his, with Artazostre, the daughter of Darius and an unnamed wife. For Herrenschmidt, there's every reason to think that for the Persians who reported these marriages to Herodotus, they were highly significant. At one level, this is no doubt true, but Herrenschmidt neglected to point out what a more recent paper by John Hyland explores, namely the marriages of Gobryas with Darius' sister and of Darius himself with his brother-in-law Gobryas' daughter. These marriages, Hyland argues, reflected, quote, the probable agency of Hystaspes, Darius' father, in arranging both unions before Darius emerged as a contender for the throne, rather than an attempt by Darius, once he was king, to consolidate power through marriage. Thus, Hyland sees the marriage in the context of, quote, the aspirations of Hystaspes and Gobryas under Cambyses. However, although Hyland noted that the marriage of Mardonius and Artazostre, quote, extended their familial connection in the next generation, he does not seem to have recognized that this was a classic cross-cousin marriage. Seen from the viewpoint of Mardonius, this was a marriage with his unnamed mother's brothers, that is, Darius' daughter, Artazostre, while from Artazostre's perspective, it was a marriage with her father's, Darius' sister's unnamed son, Mardonius. Moreover, in highlighting what he called the aspirations of Hystaspes and Gobryas, Hyland ignored one of the most salient features of marriage as, quote, a systematically organized affair which forms part of a series of contractual obligations between two groups, as opposed to a marriage representing, quote, the whims of two persons acting as private individuals, to cite Edmund Leach. The social groups which arrange such a marriage between themselves are, in almost all societies, of essentially the same kind. The core of such a group is composed of the adult males of a kin group, all resident in one place. More precisely, Leach argued that whereas he did not wish to imply that, quote, women have no part to play in the arrangement of a marriage, or that remotely situated kinsfolk are wholly ignored, he did feel that, quote, the corporate group of persons who have the most decisive say in bringing about an arranged marriage is always a group of co-resident males representing, as a rule, 3 genealogical generations, namely the old men or grandfathers, the normal adults or fathers, and the young adults or sons. And in normal circumstances, membership in such a group is defined by descent as well as residence. There are so many missing data points in our genealogical information on the Persian nobility that it would be useless to speculate too much on the details of such a hypothetical arrangement. We do not know, for example, whether any kinship ties existed between Hystaspes or his father Arsames and Gobryas and his father Mardonius the Elder. But the fundamental point made by Hyland still stands with respect to the participants in the marriages of Darius, Mardonius, and Artazostre, namely that this was less about them than it was about their elders and the alliances they wished to forge, using, in the case of Mardonius and Artazostre, cross-cousin marriage as a vehicle. And what of parallel cousin alliances? Although Herrenschmidt found these to be extremely rare in the totality of Greek literature, she identified one within the Achaemenid descent group, that is, the marriage between Darius, eldest son of Xerxes, and thus grandson of Darius I, and Amestris, a son of Xerxes and Amestris, to Artente, a daughter of Xerxes' younger brother, that is, Darius's paternal uncle, Masistes, and an unnamed mother, as related by Herodotus. The melodramatic novella in Herodotus that's built around this marriage packs much more of a punch than a simple kinship diagram of a parallel cousin marriage suggests, and has all the suspense of an opera. Indeed, Drew Griffith called the story, quote, a quasi-Sophoclean tragedy of error. And although married to a mistress, Xerxes fell in love with his brother Masistes' wife. Out of respect for his brother, however, Xerxes accepted her refusal of his advances, but at the same time married off his son Darius to Masistes and the unnamed wife's daughter Artente, as a way of maintaining access to the object of his desire. Hence, not as a parallel cousin marriage with a rational political or economic motivation. While sharing his palace at Susa with Darius and Artente, Xerxes proceeded to fall in love with his daughter-in-law, and they began a relationship. Meanwhile, Xerxes received a beautiful robe from his wife Amestris, who had woven it herself, but he made the mistake of appearing in it when he next saw Artente. Being pleased with her, Xerxes offered Artente anything she might possibly desire. When she chose the very robe Amestris had given him, Xerxes became fearful lest this would provide proof of his affair, offering Artente cities, gold beyond measure, and an army for her own command, but she would have nothing but the robe. Learning of this, Amestris convinced himself that this was not Artente's doing, but her mother's. And on Xerxes' birthday, when the king granted gifts to those who requested them, Amestris asked for Artente's mother. Xerxes, as Herodotus says, nodded down, that is, acquiesced, and the unfortunate woman was borne away. Then, with the help of some of Xerxes' guards, Amestris, quote, cut off the woman's breasts and threw them to the dogs, and her nose and ears and lips likewise, and cut out her tongue, and sent her home, thus cruelly used. Anticipating the evil that Amestris might perpetrate, Xerxes tried to convince his brother Masistes to abandon his wife, even offering him one of his own daughters, but Masistes refused. Then, sensing something terrible might transpire, Masistes rushed home, and after finding the mutilated body of his wife, he immediately set off to Bactria with his sons, where he hoped to raise a rebellion against his brother. Xerxes, however, had him pursued and killed. The unnamed, mutilated mother of Artente, one assumes, died from her wounds, though the fate of Artente herself was never revealed by Herodotus. Unsurprisingly, commentators have read this story in many different ways. Although Helene Sanchisi-Verdenborg felt that it, quote, originates from Persian oral tradition, Drew Griffith suggested that it was inspired by the myth of Zeus and Semele. Erwin Wolf felt it belonged to the genre of harem stories, harem love stories, whereas other scholars have compared it with the stories of Salome and Esther. It has been understood as a dire portent of Xerxes' ultimate downfall via assassination, a deed committed by Artabanos, the commander of his bodyguard, but pinned on Xerxes' son Darius, for which the latter paid with his life, after his younger brother Artaxerxes found out and killed him, according to Ctesias. Herrenschmidt noted that, quote, the particular arrangement of this marriage and the bloody conclusion of the story might lead to the thought that patrilateral parallel cousin marriages were forbidden. Although she rejected this viewpoint, she nonetheless thought that unlike cross-cousin marriages, parallel cousin unions were decried by the lineages that were injured by them. Hence, the story of Masistes would be, if not a myth serving to illustrate the interdiction of parallel cousin marriages, then at least a stark illustration of the evils brought about by the practice. Many commentators have suggested that the story of the king's amour, or the death of Masistes, as Reginald Walter Macon called it, is an embellished tale of lust and revenge intertwined around a genuine attempt on Masistes' part to raise a rebellion in Bactria and overthrow his corrupt brother Xerxes in the aftermath of the Persian defeat at Salamis. Even if such political considerations did not complicate our understanding of the story, I do not feel that Herrenschmidt's assessment of it as an illustration of the evils of parallel cousin marriage makes any sense. Artente disappears from view just as things start to get violent, but we should not lose sight of the fact that, seen from the perspective of young Darius, Artente is the father's, that is Xerxes' brother's, Masistes' daughter, that is his parallel cousin. In his study of parallel cousin marriage in Iraqi Kurdish society, the Norwegian anthropologist Fredrik Barth noted that parallel cousins paid a reduced bride price compared to more distant kin or unrelated marriage partners, leading him to ask, quote, what are the advantages gained in this system by giving one's daughter to a brother's son, which compensate one for the loss of the bride price? The answer, he suggested, was political, since Kurdish villages were, quote, characterized by a constant struggle for political power on the part of a majority of the adult men, at times even women. And a man can expect political support only from his agnatic relatives, those who by descent belong to his political subsection, which consists primarily of brothers' sons and brothers' sons. If a man alienates his nephews by refusing them their traditional rights, he loses their political support. If he, on the other hand, gives them his daughters in marriage, the ties are reinforced and lineage solidarity maintained. Decades later, the Dutch scholar Martin van Bruinissen stressed that in Kurdistan, quote, there's a clear preference for marriage with the father's brother's daughter. In fact, a girl's father's brother's son, like Darius, son of Xerxes, has the theoretical right to deny her to anyone else. And if a father's brother's son, again, think of Darius, proposes the girl's father, think of Masistes, finds it difficult, if the father's brother's son proposes, the girl's father finds it difficult, if not impossible, to refuse him. It is evident that a consistent practice of this marriage type leads to extreme segmentariness, whereas cross-cultural marriage cements multiple relationships between lineages. The strict endogamy resulting from father's brother's daughter's marriage only enhances the segmentary character of the lineages. The lineages are completely isolated. There are no affinal relations to soften the potential conflicts between them. It may be argued, of course, that the ultimate tragedies in the story of Xerxes, Darius, Amestris, Masistes, his wife, and Ardiante are on a very different plane. Xerxes brought about the destruction of his brother's family and was eventually murdered. Masistes and his son attempted to launch a rebellion and were all killed. The tragedy of brother-to-brother rivalry is, however, somehow banal in the context of Iranian history when, as noted earlier, Safavid Qajar, Arsacid, and of course Achaemenid holders or contenders for the throne did not hesitate to eliminate their rivals by the dozen, sometimes hundreds, though this was usually prior to or in the process of consolidating power. Perhaps the significance of parallel cousin marriage in the case of Darius and Ardiante lies rather in the strengthening effect it would have had, but for Xerxes' Eros, in bolstering a segmentary lineage and shoring it up against potential threats from not quite so near kin. After all, as the Dund in Pakistan said, quote, marriage with Dada Potri, that's father's brother's daughter, is a good marriage. If my brother has a daughter and I have a son, I will always ask for her in marriage before I ask outside. With this kind of marriage, everyone is known to everyone else. I know if my brother and his daughter are good people or not, and so with this marriage, there is no trouble afterwards. In a similar vein, father's brother's daughter marriage is seen as fostering good relations between two brothers. Yet another issue is raised in this story, moreover, a girl's marriage with her paternal uncle. According to Herodotus, Xerxes demanded of his brother, quote, you must live no longer with her who is now your wife. I give you my daughter in her place. Take her for your own, but put away the wife that you have, for it is not my will that you should have her. This was, of course, a measure of extreme desperation on Xerxes' part, an offer made to avert what he rightly sensed would be a catastrophe, both for himself and his brother's family. And what of the phenomenon of niece marriage? Two of Darius I's nieces, the unnamed daughter of his sister and brother-in-law Gobryas, and Fratagune, the only child of his brother Artanes, became his wives. According to Herodotus, quote, this Artanes was brother to King Darius and son of Hystaspes, who was the son of Arsames. And when he gave his daughter in marriage to Darius, he dowered her with the whole wealth of his house, she being his only child. In the so-called Levitical decrees, which hold a prominent place in rabbinical law, such marriages were not only permitted, but considered meritorious, with the caveat that it usually involved the marriage of a brother with his sister's daughter rather than a brother with his brother's daughter, as proposed by Xerxes to Masistes. In Claudius the God, Robert Graves included a memorable scene in which Vitellius recommends that Claudius marry his niece, Agrippinilla. Claudius protests, "But Vitellius, she's my niece. I can't marry my niece, can I?" Vitellius replies by saying he'd be happy to approach the Senate for their consent, and continues, "And why shouldn't an uncle and niece marry? The Parthians do it, and theirs is a very old civilization. And in the Herod family, there have been more marriages between uncle and niece than any other sort." Claudius thinks a moment and replies, "That's right. Herodias married her uncle Philip, and then deserted him and ran off with her uncle Antipas. And Herod Agrippa's daughter Berenike married her uncle Herod Polio, king of Chalcis. Why shouldn't the Caesars be as free as the Herods?" To which Vitellius says that in contrast to brother-sister incest, quote, "It may well be that our very earliest ancestors allowed uncle and niece to marry because there's nowhere any disgust expressed in ancient classical literature for Pluto's marriage with his niece Proserpine." Clarice Herenschmidt suggested that the uncle-niece marriage arranged by Artanes between his daughter Fratagune and his brother Darius was intended to conserve Artanes' wealth within the narrowest confines of the Achaemenid dynasty, since a cross-cousin marriage would have put that wealth in the hands of the spouse's family. Interestingly, such a basic economic argument was not among those traditionally considered by biblical and Talmudic scholars. According to Johann David Michaelis, in the East, the relationship with the brother's daughter was not considered as close as that with the father's sister, a point underscored by the fact that in Muslim societies, relatives who could see an aunt unveiled could only see a daughter veiled. In his famous study of ancient Israel, Heinrich Ewald contended that in contrast to Roman society, a father's reputation was less injured by a marriage between an uncle and a niece than by an aunt and a nephew. None of these justifications is particularly satisfying. And as Moses Meltziner noted in 1901, whereas Roman Catholic canon law, as well as English statutory law, prohibited uncle-niece marriage, quote, "In other Protestant states of Europe, such marriages are allowed. In some of the states of this country," he wrote, and this is 1901, "as in Ohio, Illinois, Michigan, and Louisiana, they are unlawful by statute, but elsewhere they were not prohibited. In fact, whereas uncle-niece and aunt-nephew marriages are today prohibited and considered a Class E felony, such marriages were legal in New York until 1893. The renowned Scottish anthropologist and folklorist Sir James G. Fraser discussed uncle-niece marriage amongst the Hovas of Madagascar. He wrote, "The king generally married not his sister but her daughter, his niece, and the children whom he had by her were the heirs to the throne in virtue of a twofold right, since they inherited the blood royal from their mothers as well as from their fathers. It is possible that a similar motive may explain the leave granted by some peoples to an uncle to marry his niece in the case in which the niece is his sister's daughter. Such a marriage would serve the same purpose as marriage with a sister and would be less shocking to traditional sentiment, though no mention is made here of marrying a brother's daughter. The matter of uncle-niece marriage, which was sanctioned in the Bible but deemed too close for comfort in the late 19th century West, brings us to the broader topic of close kin or incestuous marriage. In 1645, the first edition of Pierre Durayer's French translation of Herodotus's histories appeared, and unsurprisingly, it soon became a source for enterprising authors in search of new material. One writer who delved into the Persian past was the young poet and playwright Philippe Quinault. Two plays with strong roots in Herodotus appeared in 1656. La Mort de Cyrus, The Death of Cyrus, and Le Mariage de Cambyses, The Marriage of Cambyses, both identified by their author as tragicomedies. Writing about Quinault's dramatic works, William Brooks suggested that, quote, Quinault takes from his sources from his source a few ideas and names: Gobryas, Prexaspes, Megabyzas, Otanes, Phaidima, Parmis, and invents the rest, including infant substitution and the salacious thrill of possible incest. Thus, early in Act 2, Scene 1 of the marriage of Cambyses, Atossa, the historical Udusana of the Persepolis fortification texts, whom we know was a daughter of Cyrus, and therefore a sister or half-sister of Cambyses, tells her sister Ariston, obviously a name recalling Artistone, the historical Irashtuna, that regardless of how charming the crown is in her eyes, she dare not touch the hand that offers it. For although Cambyses was so dear to her that he could not please her more, to call him lover was repugnant to the designation of him as brother. And as attractive as marriage with him might seem to be, it must be odious, an insult to nature and an offense to the gods. In Cambyses' case, it would seem the incest theme was not Quinault's invention. Nevertheless, scholars have debated long and hard whether it was Herodotus's. According to Herodotus, Cambyses had not one but two incestuous relationships with siblings, although the veracity of his claims has been questioned. In the first place, as I mentioned earlier, we're not certain who Cambyses' mother was. She may have been Cassandane, Amitis, or Naititis. Herodotus called Cyrus's Egyptian wife, quote, the newcomer from Egypt, and alleged that as an Egyptian interloper, her presence prompted Cambyses' decision, when only 10 years old, to one day conquer Egypt as a way of avenging his own mother, Cassandane's honor. That's assuming that was really his mother. Secondly, neither Herodotus nor any other source reveals who the mother or mothers of Atossa and the unidentified second daughter of Cyrus were, who were said to have married Cambyses. Herodotus is explicit in asserting that the younger of the two sisters whom he married and whom he had killed in Egypt was a full sister. The fact that Atossa was not so qualified may be at the root of the belief, sometimes found in the literature, that Atossa was a half-sister, but this remains a conjecture and nothing more. Nor is there any reason to suggest, as the Lutheran theologian Christian Mathieu did in 1699, that Atossa and her unnamed sister were compelled to marry Cambyses through the use of force. Although few commentators on Herodotus and the Persian Empire have questioned the accusation of royal incest on the part of Cambyses, this has changed in recent years. Maria Brosius, for example, wrote, quote, against the accusation of Cambyses' incestuous marriage stands Herodotus' own statement that Cambyses was married to Otanes' daughter Phaidime, as well as Ctesias' reference to a wife named Roxanne, whom he does not identify as a sister. Furthermore, the fact that the accusation of incest is listed in a series of sacrilegious acts committed by Cambyses, all of which are to emphasize his insanity and hubris, should caution against their existence. They derive from a common Egyptian source, hostile to Cambyses, and some of these atrocities, such as the killing of the Apis bull, have been proved to be untrue. Cambyses' alleged incest could, of course, be a case of slander, but if not, it would not be a unique case of such behavior. For example, according to the Carlomagnus saga, Charlemagne had an illicit liaison with his sister, Gilles, and failed to confess this to the abbot Aegidius until the angel Gabriel brought a letter from God exposing it and ordering Charlemagne to give his sister to Milon d'Angleterre in marriage. Charlemagne made Milon the Duke of Brittany, and 7 months later, Gilles gave birth to the future hero Roland. Other medieval sources simply say that Charlemagne suffered under the weight of a great unnamed sin all his life. Rather than dismissing Herodotus' account of Cambyses' two incestuous alliances, some scholars have tried to understand them in an Egyptian or early Iranian cultural context. In 1879, Philip Kuyper suggested that in making Cambyses the creator of the tradition of brother-sister marriage among the Persians, Herodotus was simply trying to fix the practice in space and time for his audience. Wilhelm Geiger, on the other hand, attributed Cambyses' incestuous marriages to the fact that he wished to keep the royal blood pure from admixture with other families, a view later expressed by Franz Cumont as well. In 1956, KMT Atkinson suggested that Cambyses' marriage to his unnamed full sister, quote, whom he took with him to Egypt, was in accordance with Egyptian royal tradition, but by no means in accordance with Persian. Citing Yima's act of incest with his twin sister, Yimak, in Bundehishen 23, Hoffmann and Vorbichler suggested that sibling marriage was a pre-Zoroastrian religious act unappreciated by Herodotus' Greek audience. In marrying his sister, Cambyses, they argued, Cambyses was simply enacting the mythological act of Yima, the first man, and his sister. An entirely speculative scenario was envisaged by Herrenschmidt, who suggested that brother-sister marriage in the Persian royal family indicated a reluctance to engage in the normal exogamous exchange of women and might reflect friction between the Thespids, that is the family of Cyrus, and other noble families. The German ancient historian Ernst Kornemann, on the other hand, was much more interested in why, among all Indo-European speaking peoples, the Persians, at least the royal house, followed a pattern of what he considered explicit endogamy, unlike the Romans, for whom it was strictly rejected. His conclusion, such a practice was a holdover from the pre-Indo-European and pre-Semitic population that had left a memory of sibling marriage in the mythology of various peoples living around the Mediterranean, but this was a practice that only the Persians and Egyptians actually continued. Similar view was held by Ernst Herzfeld. What he termed the endogamy of the Achaemenids was not innate to the ancient Iranians, he felt, but based on allegedly rampant brother-sister marriage in Elam, about which I spoke last week, as propounded by Koenig, and I hope debunked in my last lecture. It was an inheritance from the region's Ureinwohnern, or aboriginal population, i.e. the Elamites. My own inclination is rather to try to understand the rare but well-attested practice of royal brother-sister marriage in a broader context. As with cross-cousin and parallel cousin marriage, or succession to high office by a ruler's sister's son, the anthropological literature has much to contribute to a better understanding of brother-sister marriage. In 1929, the British anthropologist Brenda Seligman suggested that the brother-sister incest taboo, quote, not only prevents rivalry between brother and brother and between sister and sister, but it removes a second sphere of rivalry between father and son, thereby minimizing the risk of disharmony, fission, and violent conflict in a family. According to Rio Franklin Fortune's alliance-based approach to incest, the prohibition, quote, is adopted not because of its internal value to the family, but because the external value of the marriage alliance is essential to social structure. Seligman rejected this logic, however, arguing that, quote, rather than providing a new theory of incest, Fortune shows a principle for the retention of its laws and offers a sociological basis for exceptions. It would seem that society tolerates incest when the social structure has nothing to gain from its prohibition. This, however, is only partially true. Supernatural sanction has come to aid the enforcement of the law and does not easily fade as soon as the social structure has no need for it. In fact, as Seligman stressed, in most non-Western societies, no punishment is prescribed in cases of incest. Rather, what she called the supernatural sanction in the form of disease or death, the fear of which may frequently even lead to suicide, is the ultimate sanction. Although neither Herodotus nor Seligman cited Cambyses as a case in point, after reading this, I could not help but think that for medieval and later readers of Herodotus, Cambyses' childlessness, alleged madness, and early death are powerful arguments for seeing divine sanction at work in Cambyses' case. But another perspective raised by James Fraser of Golden Bough fame is also relevant. In discussing the Banyoro, a Bantu-speaking group located near Lake Albert on the present-day border of Uganda and the Democratic Republic of Congo, Fraser noted, quote, to the rule of exogamy observed by the totemic clans of the Biennial, there was one remarkable exception. Princes might cohabit with princesses and have children by them, though in such cases the couple necessarily belonged to the same totemic clan. However, this cohabitation was not marriage. Citing John Roscoe, Fraser went on to say, quote, "The rule was for princes and princesses to live together promiscuously and not to regard each other as husband and wife, though the king might take a princess and keep her in his enclosure. He might even cohabit thus with his full sister and beget children by her. Similarly, we find that among the Bahima, the princes were allowed to marry their own sisters. What is the reason for these remarkable anomalies? A simple and highly probable explanation of the marriage of a king or chief with his sister was long ago suggested by J.F. McLennan. Under a system of motherkin, a man's heirs are his sister's sons, which I talked about last Friday. And accordingly, where that system prevails, it is the king's sister's son, not his own son, who succeeds him on the throne. According to immemorial tradition, a king's heirs were his sister's sons. Hence, if he only married his sister, her sons would also be his. The system of maternal descent would be combined with paternal descent. Time-honored usage would be respected, while the natural instincts of a father would also be satisfied. Needless to say, McLennan, followed by Fraser, here fell into the same trap as F.W. Koenig when writing about Elamite incestuous marriage, and I fear with as little success. But at least it puts Koenig in good company. In conclusion, I would suggest that Herodotus and most of his subsequent readers might have been surprised by Lewis Henry Morgan's distinction, which I've mentioned several times in these lectures, between classificatory and descriptive kinship terminology. As Morgan wrote in Ancient Society, in classificatory systems, consanguinei are never described but are classified into categories, irrespective of their nearness to all the persons in the same, of their nearness or remoteness in degree to ego, and the same term of relationship is applied to all the persons in the same category. Thus, my own sisters and the daughters of my mother's sisters are alike, all alike my sisters. The thrust here should be obvious, and particularly since Herodotus specified that Cambyses' first wife was a full sister. The suspicion must arise that all other sisters were potentially classificatory sisters, that is, what we would call cousins. If that is the case, then the question is less why incest than what kind of cousin marriage is involved, parallel or cross. Thank you.